All right, we're gonna get started. I published this morning, so I don't know how many people have seen it yet, gone through it in any level of detail, but I thought I'd at least go over it so that we're all on the same page for what this final project is going to look like. So scheduled for the remainder of the quarter, we have a last exam on the last day of class. And for the moment, my plan is for this paper to be due on the Wednesday of finals. Because there is no final in here, there's nothing happening during that week. I want to balance, one, giving you enough time to do all of this, and two, giving Hunter and myself enough time to grade these by the time the grading deadline hits. So Wednesday seems to be, I would love to give you until Friday, but I think with how many people are in here and how much content there's going to be in these papers, it's going to take quite a Herculean effort, to use ChatGPT wording, to get all of this done by the grading deadline. So I can't really push it past that if I want to do a good pass on these papers and give them grades they actually deserve.
You should have us all roll dice to decide what day of the week the paper is going to be due on.
That just sounds like a terrible
My
idea.
luck is horrible with that.
I'm gonna get mine on Friday and live in Las
Should I use a
Vegas.
2D10? Should I use a 2D6 or a 10D6? So
20.
So there are two sections to this paper. The first section is required for undergraduates. That's required for everybody. But the point spread is different across undergraduates and graduates. And the reason for that is that section 2 is required for graduate students and is extra credit for undergraduates. Sorry, graduate students, there's no extra credit opportunity for you here. That said, I think you're all in a very good place, so I'm not particularly worried about any of you. So section 1 is dealing with the base harmony. So section 1, the analysis of the benefits and costs. So just go into what are the benefits, how did you break them down, what are the costs, how did you break them down, how did you understand the game. Then describe the process you used to arrive at a value function for all of the cards given and the rules of the game. Any assumptions that you made as part of that. So for instance, the assumptions that were made in the game that we were looking at, that very basic game about the value of the strength of a card, we've made assumptions that everything was between 1 and 5. And that allowed us, we made an assumption that cards had an equal distribution of strength 1 to strength 5 in the final set of cards. So any assumptions that you need to make about the function that you end up coming up with, make sure you state those assumptions and justify the assumption that you made. It is okay to make assumptions. You just have to know that the assumption has some value. So then you're going to do a deck by deck analysis. So what is the cumulative value of all of the cards in a deck? So just like a card can have a value, if you sum up all of the values of all of the cards in deck A and deck B and deck C and deck D, what were those values based on the function that you came up with? Then analyze, do the values of those decks map to the experiences that you had playing Harmony? So we found that decks A and B were significantly stronger than decks C and D. So does the function that you came up with, when applied to all of the cards and all of the decks, come up with a cumulative value for each of those decks that supports that decks A and B are better than decks C and D? If not, then you can have some kind of argument about why you think that your function is still correct, even though it doesn't map to the experience that we had. Maybe there is something that we didn't see, something that we didn't notice. Then you're going to go through and modify the balance of the existing cards. So costs are going to change. The values of draw, a card that used to be draw 3 will now be draw 2 or draw 4. A card that used to draw might heal now instead of draw. You can completely change up, given the existing rules within Harmony, try to balance these cards to the point where these decks have both an identity and that they are equally balanced against each other. The idea would be you sit down with someone who is equally skilled at Harmony, and it doesn't matter which deck you pick, which deck they pick, there should be a 50% win rate at the beginning of the game. Or as close as you can get to a 50% win rate. based on the decisions that and balanced decisions that you made with those cards. So describe the process. Then you're gonna gather some data. We're gonna be playtesting in class Monday and Tuesday. It'll be up to you whether you want to play test with your modified balanced harmony decks or if you add any mechanics. And in fact, maybe we spend more than Monday and Tuesday next week doing this. It'll depend on how much work I feel is left to do, how much value we think is left, how much data we can collect in class, how many questions people have. But feel free to make some friends and play this outside of class to continue to collect some additional data. With that data that you collect, do we get closer to that even win rate? So if you kept track of the win rate of deck A versus deck B, deck A versus deck C, you will not be able to play enough probably to get a reasonable sample for all of this. So there will be small sample concerns with everything that you do. That's okay. That's just one of the limitations of not having a ton of time for this. So then describe the identity of each deck. So as you design these decks, what is the purpose? How should they see, how should someone approach playing this deck? Is one deck an aggressive deck that's trying to shred your opponent's hand before they have a chance to react? Or another deck that's trying to shred your opponent's library, your draw deck, before they can do anything about it? Do you have a defensive deck that's trying to utilize a lot of draw and heal to stay alive to the late game, where you can play very expensive cards, and those expensive cards try to, with just a few cards played, utilize all your resources, but then overwhelm and win the game because you have defensive options and a few very offensive options that you can't use until the end of the game. So you can come up with different deck identities that try to play as distinctly as possible from each other, utilizing these mechanics, but are still balanced against each other, still have that equal win rate. How do you get there? Then based on that play, I assume that you're not going to get there. This will not work out perfectly. You will have done the best that you can do with the time that you have and your understanding of the system. Just the amount of time is likely to be a huge factor here. So you're not going to fully get there, and that's also okay. As long as you can justify what you did, what you thought was going to happen, what actually happened when you played it, and then your analysis of what happened. If you had even more time, what would you go back and change? What would you go back and do to further iterate this to come up with something that is more balanced? That is still an improvement. Basically, what weaknesses exist in your process so far? Identify those and figure out what you could do with more time to go fix those. So that's the entirety of section 1. Something about me as a professor, for those of you who don't know, when I give a suggestion for a particular length of something, I don't expect you to be in that window necessarily. There's no grade item associated with the length of this paper. If you can meet all of these outcomes in 2 or 2.5 pages, great, I don't care. If you want to write 10 single-space pages about this, great, I don't care. My suggestion is my best approximation. If I were to go write this, to go do this and write this out, this is about the length that I think my paper would be. Just to give you a sense of how much detail approximately am I looking for. So again, don't worry about it being a little shorter than that. Please do not add fluff. Please do not try to cut out important information. Just make sure that it is the best that you can do and that it meets all of these particular outcomes to the best of your ability. So no actual outcome based on the length. I can't imagine that you could do this in 1 page.
Is that a challenge?
Someone will try. I don't think it will go well.
Submit 2 things. Here's my 1-page attempt. Here's my actual attempt.
That would be fun. And in machine learning, I would say, all right, let's actually apply some dimensionality reduction to your paper. How can you make the best 1-page paper that you can? How can you make the best 1-paragraph paper that you can?
See a solution, shrink the text down.
Yeah,
Never specify.
you do. Yeah, you don't give us.
Yeah, that's why I don't give a font or a size. Again, I just don't care. It's not incredibly relevant to this. I'm assuming it's 11 or 12 point font, one of the typical fonts. That's why I also say 3 to 4 page. I don't know for sure, but that's about the level of detail that I think is needed to actually do this justice. Section 2, again, optional and extra credit for undergrads, but required for grads. This is when you're going to be modifying the actual mechanics of Harmony. So a description of what mechanics you added to the game, changed about the game. So does heal now just do something different than it did before? It's still the same idea, but now it's pulling from somewhere else or it's doing something else. There's an added cost to something. Maybe heal now puts cards from your discard into your deck, but for every 5 cards you heal, you have to discard 1. Or you can change the actual rules of these keywords to add an extra cost or an extra strategic concept. You can also remove things from the game. You think heal is crazy overpowered? Get rid of it. There's no way to take things from the discard pile and reuse them. So you have full creative control over the game. I think that everyone should give this an attempt, but I don't think there's enough time to require it for everyone. But I think this is where a lot of the learning would happen. So I really urge you to play around with this. So what did you do? Justify the changes that you made. Think about that from a strategic angle. So everything that you add or change or remove should be for the health of the game, should be for how many options a player has on a particular turn. Are you adding to the number of things that a player could actually reasonably do, increasing the strategic depth? Accessibility. You could also say, this mechanic is overly complicated for what it does. I'm going to simplify it so that it's easier to use, but still has that same strategic depth. You can make an accessibility argument. Just the depth and complexity of the game. Any of those are reasonable changes to make and can be justified based on who you're targeting the game toward. Then what changes did you make for your value function? When you add mechanics or remove mechanics, it's going to completely change the value of each of those mechanics with respect to each other. So you'll have to go back and do a full pass over your card value function to figure out, in this new version of this game, everything is different. How different is each element and why? So justify the changes that you made. Any evaluation changes to the existing mechanics. And then data you collected playtesting the new decks. So did you get close to that equal win rate? And then very similarly, how would you continue this process? Now that you have gathered that data on what you did to the best of your ability with the time constraints, now that you have that information, what other mechanics would you like to be able to add and balance? What looked like it was unnecessary, and so you want to remove it or change it in some way to make it easier, less complicated, more balanced. So I think that's about a 2 to 3 page write-up. That's my best guess for how long that would be. I tied each one of these bullet points from section 1 to an associated grading outcome in the same order. So if you're wondering, benefit and cost analysis worth 20 points, you want to make sure you do that, go up to this first bullet point. And there's a bigger description of exactly what kinds of questions you should be thinking about as you implement that. So it just gives an associated grade for that outcome. For undergraduates, everything in section 1 is doubled in terms of the total number of points compared to the graduates, because this is the entire assignment for the undergraduates. So it needs to add to the total number of points that I made this out of. And then it's halved for graduates. For section 2, I did the exact opposite. So the graduate value is doubled, but the combined value of everything from part 1 and part 2 for the grad students is the 200 points of the assignment. Everything from the first section is 200 points for the undergraduates, but there's an extra 50 points available in section 2 for undergraduates as well. So since this is 20% of your overall course grade, if you are an undergraduate, there's an extra 5% of your grade that you can get back from the extra credit if you do section 2. Questions on any of the clarity from any of this? If you feel like anything is missing, any other issues? Yeah.
On a certain number of mechanics change.
At least one added, changed, or removed. I'm not going to specify an exact number. I think that if you change one thing, you may find that you need to change something else to ease the balance of that and kind of find an equilibrium point, but no, there's no absolute minimum. Just find something that you think would improve the game. What direction would you choose that improves the game from some perspective and be able to justify that it is an improvement? Other questions?
I think it makes sense, but I won't know until I actually get to do it.
Yes.
We'll see. I'm gonna try to set aside some time on my flight to work on finishing out the spreadsheet. But we'll see.
Does this feel doable in the about 2 weeks that you have?
Maybe if I wasn't taking 4 other classes, yeah.
I don't know how you do it. How are you still sane?
I don't know.
Taking 5 classes?
Yeah. I was like 23 credits behind after I finished my major. So I needed just a bunch of credits, so I'm taking 5 classes this quarter.
I feel bad.
Why are you taking any for hundreds at all?
Because I have to. I need like 2 more 400 levels and then like 30 credits, and then I can graduate.
We
Yeah.
also have another exam along with this,
There will be an exam next Friday, yes.
and this is due when?
This is due the Wednesday of finals. So if a week from Friday is the exam and 2 weeks from today is when, or tonight is when this would be due. It's a lot, but I also think that this is kind of a culmination of everything that we've been learning and doing in the class to be able to say, can we make intelligent changes to games? We've really been thinking from a designer's perspective. We haven't applied anything from a designer's perspective yet. And you'll be doing that in a video game next quarter, but to really take this for the game that we've been playing throughout and be able to really think about the player's perspective from this and get some playtest data with it. I think that's really important. Other questions? I want to give people a little bit of time to kind of digest this. Think about a plan for it. Obviously, I am around if you'd like to bounce any ideas off of me. I'd happily whiteboard out some of these ideas and give you some of my thoughts on what you're running with or what you're doing. So this is not just, I expect to not see you at all between now and when you turn this in. Let's have a little bit of back and forth. And I want to make sure there's enough class time next week for you to actually get this data so that you don't have to do at least that part of it outside of class. But what you should be thinking about between now and Monday is, what are those changes? What changes do you want to make? How will you justify those changes in terms of your value function? And then that's what the extra deck of cards that you have, extra sets of decks of cards are for. It's for you to put your changed information, your finalized harmony on to that, and you will bring that in to play around with and play test. How are we doing? Other questions or concerns? All right, we'll dive into a little bit of content then. I like how PowerPoint just stopped having a symbol down here. No matter how many times I restart my computer, it's just a.
It probably got pushed to the tray.
Yeah, it's a. Weird.
Yeah.
Fun. All right, so where we were last time, we talked about the problem that we had with character creations and all of the possibilities here for what we could do about designing for different character creation systems. So do you design for viable builds or optimal builds, and what happens when what are the downsides of targeting either viable builds or optimal builds? What do we have to consider from a design perspective when we do that? So we came up with some solutions as well. We said we could introduce difficulty levels, market to a particular type of gamer. try to reduce the difference between viable and optimal builds. What I highlighted is, I think the best thing that you can do to try to minimize that difference, which means that if you target one or the other, you're minimizing the concerns associated with the other one. We also talked about power coming from items rather than character builds, and if you do that, that helps to do that. All else equal, if you put more power in the items or the equipment of your game, then that by itself reduces the difference, the power difference between viable and optimal builds. But I said that I was going to come back and talk about Path of Exile's interactive systems and how many of these things there are to balance. So active skills in the game that can be used by any character class, 274. Balancing between 274 skills that work at different range, target different numbers of enemies on the screen. Is it a single target? Is it multi-target? Is it ranged? Is it melee? How much danger is the character in to use this skill? How fast does it, what is its cast time? What is its critical strike chance? All of these have multiplicative changes to the associated balance of the skill. What is its mana cost? There are so many based on what you can do in the game. You can change that mana cost and turn it into a life cost. If you do that, how does that modify the value of the skill? There are 177 supports, and a lot of these, each one of these supports works with probably on average about a quarter of the skills. So these supports can be used across any of the different skills. Any projectile skill can now use multiple projectiles and create a spread of projectiles. You can fork. Whenever it hits, it creates additional projectiles that go off in a random direction from that enemy. You can chain. When a projectile hits an enemy, it sees, is there another enemy within a particular radius, and then makes a projectile from the target to that. You can add all of those or some of those to any projectile skill in the game. If it's a spell projectile, if it's an attack-based projectile from a bow, does not matter. So balancing every skill with every possible set of supports that it could have against each other, there's a multiplicative benefit between all of that. But of course, those are just the skills that you choose to have. What about the passive skill tree? You get 120-ish passive skill points, and there are 1,325 passive nodes for you to choose from.
How
So-
many spreadsheets do you think there are to balance on them?
Not,
So many.
they're never enough.
Yeah. Just like, how do you balance this much? And the answer is, you don't.
That's
And
how
that's
our
They have
parents
no
did it.
spreadsheets, they just play it by ear.
You do the best that you can do, and the best that you can do is never going to be optimal or probably even good enough. You just get it to the best place that you can have it so that people can have fun with their skills. But there are a number of active skills that nobody uses because the downsides, or it just doesn't have the upsides of some of the other skills, even though numerically it's balanced. And we see this all the time in a spreadsheet with Path of Exile. It looks like the skill is numerically balanced, but when it comes to the actual gameplay, how much danger are you in when you use the skill? Does it open you up to an animation that means that you can be hit? There's way more to actually consider than just how much damage does it deal per second? How many enemies does it target? There's still way more quality of life features. Does it move your character when you do it? There are lots to consider. So considerations to all of these: how much damage, how much range, what is the base speed, what is the base crit chance, what's the mana cost, how does scaling the damage effectiveness of any of these support gems work? The damage type, because each different type of damage can cause different kinds of ailments. If you use cold damage on something, then it's going to either chill or freeze, which is a nice defensive layer. If you use lightning, then you can shock to increase the damage that a follow-up skill does after that, based on the amount of damage you do proportional to the enemy's HP. The extent to which the character investment of any of these affects the behavior. So if you make a viable versus an optimal passive skill tree, how does that affect the associated balance and damage of all of the skills in the game? There's just so much to consider that, again, you're never going to get it right on a spreadsheet alone. You need to really take into account the play experience to be able to figure out what the associated balance should be. That said, spreadsheets are a good place to start. That's a good initial balance point that you will then work away from as you gather more data. Questions on this? How many people have I convinced to play Path of Exile with large numbers?
Already playing.
I've tried to play it, I can't handle it.
How many people have I steered away from it by saying large numbers?
Just give them the passage.
I'll work with all of you later. I'll get you on board with it.
If I download it right now, can I get extra credit?
No. There will be reasons beyond credit. It's only the best game that's ever been made.
I told you, I tried to play it before, my computer's just too old, it cannot handle it.
Time to get on the computer.
I don't have the money.
I know. So.
Get a job.
Hey, IT has openings if any of you wanna be IT in this building, because I'm graduating next quarter.
Yeah, it's true. If you want to be the go-to person, work for IT. Let's talk about God stats and dump stats. So this is a kind of a weirdly industry term. So a God stat is either overpowered or required for a particular build in order for that build to do what it's supposed to do. So as an example, something like if your bow's damage scales 100% off of dexterity, there is no way if you're going to be an archer that uses bows that you would not want to put points in dexterity. It becomes where most of your points are going to go because that is the way to deal damage. A dump stat is not required at all for a build. So you can imagine intelligence only scales spell damage. That's all intelligence does, but you are a bow build. Then intelligence becomes a dump stat. It's just not there with respect to what you're considering, where you're considering placing your stat points. So that's the fact that God stats and dump stats even exist will create, when you have the decision of where to put your stat point, it becomes a less interesting decision because you have fewer options, there are fewer trade-offs, there's a right answer and a wrong answer, or there are more right answers and more wrong answers. And that becomes really apparent from the player's perspective, but it also represents just poor design in general. So if you're trying to design your stats and what do your stats actually affect and do, this does not have to be strength, dexterity. This can be in any game genre, in any. So I'm imagining stats in something like a visual novel being like your level of introversion versus extroversion that would unlock certain different kinds of responses to social situations. So you can apply stats to any domain in any genre that would allow for different play experiences. But you want all elements of a build to be at least marginally useful. So if you have stats, you want those stats to be meaningful, and you want to give people a reason to use those stats. So historically, strength affects carrying capacity in a lot of Western style RPGs, for instance, and that becomes relevant to all characters. All characters want to be able to, all else equal, carry more back to town to sell. So it means that there's a reason to invest some points in strength regardless of which character you are, but that it also makes a bit of sense in terms of strength affecting carrying capacity, and that if you're a frail mage, it doesn't make sense that you can carry 300, 400 pounds of gear back with you, whereas if you're a strong melee type, then it makes sense that you'd be able to carry a little bit more back to town. So it becomes an upside and a downside to each. You could also make strength your ability to move some things that are in the way of treasure rooms. Now, everyone wants access to that treasure. Maybe there's a mage weapon hidden in one of the chests in one of those. And if your mage has enough strength to be able to move that rock, then they can go get an equipment upgrade. So there are different ways to take the different stats and make them viable or give them a reason why any character might want to use them. You can also put everything on, or something like this, on items. But because items have a natural amount of access across all the different characters, you don't have to worry about it as much. What I mean by that is that you have, if you wanted to put something like strength on a weapon, now instead of investing your valuable stat points, in something, you could equip a basic level of strength from just the gear that you have, and that would allow you to be able to go back to places that had treasure rooms that you noticed when you didn't have the strength. You find an item, it gives you enough strength, you equip that even temporarily to go back now and access that treasure room. So that becomes an outcome from someone prioritizing and utilizing strength, even though it isn't the focus of their character. It's still something that they care about as an affix on items or to make part of their character creation or build. I've mentioned this before, but all items should be designed in such a way that there's a use for it. So if you're going to design an item, make sure that there's a time in the story or a time in your gameplay where you actually want to use that item for a particular character class, for a particular situation. There should always be a use case for anything that you design. So, but each item doesn't have to be as relevant to all characters. So you can have something like character-specific items that can only be equipped by a certain class, or something that requires a large amount of strength. Now you have a little bit of freedom in how you acquire that strength. As a mage, there's a trade-off between using a bunch of affix on your other gear to be able to equip this thing that requires a lot of strength. That's a trade-off. Of course, if you make a character and it seems like your character is viable early on in the game, and then you play the game and it becomes less and less viable over time, that's something that is very frustrating to players. So it's something that you want to signal early on in your game. If you can find a way to identify what are the not viable builds, find a way to make it less viable early in the game. So someone can very quickly realize this doesn't work. I should focus on something else. Or even have a piece of lore somewhere. Maybe there's an old man who tells the story of an adventurer who tried to use a staff as a melee weapon and was slain by the weakest enemy right outside the gates. There's a lore reason now why you're just like, well, maybe I shouldn't do that. Do I want to be that person? No.
Knowing most people, they'll be like, you can't tell me what to do. I'm gonna go do that right now.
Then there'll be someone who beats the entire game with it because they can.
Yeah, and then that becomes an interesting story or something that becomes a, if you do this, suddenly the lore becomes the reason why someone wants to do it, then it becomes cultural, and then, yeah, your game gains traction because you're engaging with aspects of the game at that point. But you, the designer, put that there. You didn't tell the player, you can't do this, but you said, basically, and for a story, within the story, there's reason for you not to try. Unless you're a masochist.
Any from software.
Yes. So if this situation happens where it seems viable early on and becomes less viable, if this is something that is data that you can collect about your game, you can determine that your players aren't making decisions that you expected them to make or thought they would make in terms of making a viable character. So why is that? Either your game is not communicating its systems well enough to these players, or they just don't understand the systems well enough to make an informed decision. So this could help point to balance problems, something that you could choose to fix if it's intended behavior. I really want people to be able to use melee staffs. I think that's cool. I want that to be viable. Is there a balance problem with melee staffs? If that is true, go buff them. Is there a game communication problem? Find a place in your game to actively communicate its system better to the player. Maybe you need to improve your tutorial. There could be player decision paralysis. There are so many options then rather than sit there and think about which ones are better than not, a player just decides, this is overwhelming, I'm going to do something at random. So if you find that your players are frequently doing things at random, maybe you want to reduce the scope of player choice. Of course, yet another be wary. I love be waries. If you try to perfectly balance everything in the game, then it becomes boring. There is no value to the player choice. If every set of player choices leads you to the same perfectly equivalent place, then those decisions lose value. So there is a middle ground that is actually worth targeting there. The decision should have value, but the game should communicate in a way that allows you to decide as the player, this is a good decision or a bad decision. Or at least have some evidence of one or the other. If it's a bug, check your source code. I don't have any direct evidence of this, but the book that I pulled some of this from does have a bit of evidence of games that have shipped where an entire stat in the game does nothing. It says that it does something, but it doesn't actually do that. It does nothing. That's unfortunate. So check your source code. Note that especially if your stats, maybe it's, I don't know, what's a dexterity that affects your chance to hit. And that chance to hit would go from 60% to 65%, or from 82% to 86%, something like this. Is that something that's noticeable in minute-to-minute gameplay? Not necessarily. So maybe your players are even playing thinking that it's doing something. If your character sheet says you have an 86% chance to hit, and you're actually hitting 82% of the time, is that going to be a bug that is found and reported? Not likely. But if it leads to that particular character not being at the top of a leaderboard for some reason, and you dive into why is this character, numerically, it should be balanced. Why is that? Maybe there's a bug in your source code. You can also, of course, increase the effect of the decisions the players have to make. But of course, if you do this, so if you increase the effect of the decisions, you're pulling apart the distance between optimal and viable builds. So it's always a trade-off. You want to find a middle ground where you get the best result that you can. You're not going to be able to make it perfect for everyone, unfortunately. Just the reality of complex systems. So just like with everything in computer science, there are always trade-offs. Even with perfectly balanced games, there will still be issues that players can have with your game. That does not necessarily mean that there's an issue with your system. So, as an example, game communication. If your game is perfectly balanced, but players don't understand your systems as well as they need to make informed decisions, then they may feel like they don't have the ability to make those informed decisions. They will complain about that, even though your system is perfectly balanced. So let's start with an interesting question to the field. How can players misinterpret the value of something in a game? What are some different examples of that? Kind of an abstract question, but an intriguing one. Yeah.
There's like an early access game that just came out called Hyper Lightbreaker, and they had strength, dexterity, blah, 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 and then a stat called ops. People are wondering like, what is ops?
Just missing an O, right? Oops.
No, yeah, basically. No, but like people are like, is it like special ops? Like, does this keep enemies from noticing me? Is it like, does it like enhance the damage of snipers? Like nobody could figure out what it does. And finally the dev got back and they're like, oh no, that's an acronym. It stands for odds per stuff. It's your luck stat.
Odds per stuff?
Odds per stuff.
Oops.
A lot of misinterpreting of what that stat did.
Yeah, there's no description of that in the game. So
Maybe
how do players make an informed decision about whether to invest in it or not?
Yep.
They don't know. That's a great example.
I dumped everything in that stat.
Well, how did that change the game?
I did not know.
Excellent.
If your game has like, a stat somewhere that say increases your chance to do a critical by X%, and then you also get an item that has X% that has like increases chance of critical by X%, or if your weapon has an X% critical chance. Are these additive? Are they multiplicative? At what
Yes.
stages are these added to the actual base critical chance, you know?
Yeah, if you want to calculate the damage that you expect to do, you should be able to recreate the formula. So based on the wording that the game uses to describe that, there could be ambiguity between exactly how the math works out for that. That is a very good point.
Yeah, I want to riff on what he was saying in this guy's favorite game. Destiny doesn't give numbers. It just says stuff. No,
Yep.
So, it'll be like, equip this and you do increased damage. And it's like, cool, I have like 4 of these that increase damage, but how much? And so
Yeah.
players will have to
Yeah.
actively go and test in order to
Some of
determine
them
which
don't
is more
even
optimal.
stack.
So one of the groups of you next quarter should make the world's best joke game where there are stats like stuff, things.
Come put it.
Yeah, put points here, don't put points here.
Just, yeah.
Yeah, something that's just maybe it's a fun way of making fun of all of the bad decisions that you could make in a game and then to make it a parody. That could be very fun. I don't know if I necessarily recommend it, but just an idea that
I'm tempted now.
you could have a lot of fun with that.
It could work if you did it, it could work if you did it as a roguelike.
Yes, yeah. Where if you fail a particular run, it's all right, I need to try this again with a different distribution, see what it does.
Put a warning at the top. We don't know what these stats do either. It's up to you to figure them out.
Yeah. Just call the game reverse engineer. Where you take on the role of an engineer going back in time, allocating points as they do it.
And then what each stat does changes for every run.
Yeah.
Oh.
We found the designer massacre.
Yes.
I love it. It's like the roguelike that deletes your save whenever you lose, or
We call Iron Man.
yeah, any game that deletes your save when you lose. It's not just hardcore. You don't just fail the ability to continue playing your character. The save is gone. You can't reload it.
One of the games I play, hot dogs, horseshoes, and hand grenades, every time there's an option you can turn on, so every time you fail a level, it just closes the game.
I think you should uninstall the game. It should make you go reinstall the game every time you lose it. That's bad. So there's also the prior experience. So if your game has strength, players who have played other games that have had strength may be coming in with a preconceived notion. Even if you have a tutorial about what strength does, some of your players may just say, yeah, I know what strength does, and not read that tutorial. So if your strength is going to do something that is different than what the experience is of someone else, maybe we want to either showcase that, have them actually play, and maybe as part of the tutorial, you see this part of the damage came from strength. This part of the damage came from just in the tutorial to further introduce the concept of what these stats actually do in practice. So yes, players make assumptions based on experience with other games. So what do you mean my rogue needs wisdom?
Street smarts, man.
Yeah.
What do you mean I can't detect a lie because my wisdom's low? I'm a pathological liar.
So you can also have your user interface just not giving you enough or relevant information. So you gain 5 stat points on level up, but how do these stats affect other game systems? Does your dexterity increase your chance to hit, your chance to evade? Does your strength increase your carrying capacity? Unless the game states this or the UI states this in some capacity, your player is going to be too blind to this to be able to do anything. And the other bad thing is if your UI is just so horribly overwhelming that there's too much going on. Does anyone want to guess the game that I'm using as an example for this from a screenshot?
I have an example.
Or just anything from Cruelty Squad is perfectly just terrible.
Cruelty Squad?
In Destiny 2, it is possible to get so many buffs and debuffs applied to your character that you cannot see them all.
Yes.
That's me. Yeah, super.
Ubisoft.
Anything, any Ubisoft game. Okay. I actually use World of Warcraft.
That doesn't surprise me.
Okay, that's fair.
Oh, I forgot you said you were gonna be mentioning it later.
Yeah, there we go. So here is an example.
Just how
This is the worst screenshot I could find taken of World of Warcraft of just the sheer amount of.
Yeah, there's a lot of
Is
stuff.
that like
there.
end game?
Not enough plugins.
Oh my god.
There sure is a lot of information.
What's happening?
Cast lava version.
I think I see 4 different people.
Protections of ancient kings.
And then there's, you're getting mana, you're getting protection.
Some percentages.
I think just the green numbers are health.
What the hell is the one of the left? The bottom left.
Protection of ancient kings.
Oh, Shaft has gone offline.
I think the
Leo seems to know exactly what this class is. Oh, this is a druid healer.
The middle laugh.
I don't play WoW, so I have no clue what this is. I just know that I don't know what's going on.
It's a raid,
Someone put a debuff on Trisket.
and
Trisket?
those are the health bars
Oh,
of all your, of
Oh my
everybody in your army.
god.
Cause it's root,
There's a
right?
DPS counter on the right, middle.
There's
Health on the
I don't
left.
know what the helmet means, I don't know what the rest of the buff.
Even people who have played WoW don't know what all of this is. That's a, but imagine being thrown into something like this right after the tutorial, if something like this was going, this is obviously a very extreme example.
I
But
feel like that girl-
getting overwhelmed by the UI is something that can easily happen and have very detrimental effects. One and then two,
And then they just added a bunch of add-ons to make it seem like more than.
there are quite a few add-ons here, yes. But some of those add-ons are useful or necessary to really optimize high-level play. So if you want to be competitive in a multiplayer game, what do you need to install and use on top of what the game provides in order for it to be useful? That's part of the game's design. If there are UI elements that are missing that are relevant to play the game optimally, then people are going to go invent those UI elements and add them as add-ons to the game that you make. So it all does tie back to the game's design, even if it's not exactly what you coded as your UI.
Yes, this.
One and then two?
No, I was just gonna off the call, it was a single arena.
Yeah,
Next, show us Path of Exile in game without a loot filter.
yes. Path of Exile without a loot filter, or just the sheer number of, you have a 6-person party in your screen and everyone has skill skins. Can you actually see the terrain behind all of the effects going off?
Yep.
Can you see that boss about to one-shot you? Nope. One and two?
So I'm curious how like third-party websites would tie into this, going back to Destiny 2 again, because
Yeah.
I've never stopped talking about it. On some of the weapons or buffs that say you do increase damage, people will go in and test. And there's a website that just has all the data that people have found testing this buff to see how much it does. And that's how, like, I know Radiant gives you 25% extra damage because people
Yeah.
have tested it, even though it doesn't say in game. How does that relate to this?
So if players are reverse engineering, or you want, the game is structured so that players want to reverse engineer something, then you should just publish it. That's, at least that's my view of it, unless of course it's something that you really want to hide behind. Like, what are the particular drop rates of the rarest items in the game? That is something that you don't necessarily want to publish because it would either discourage people, or you want people to go through the work to figure that out. But on the other hand, if it's a particular ability and how much does this particular passive or buff ability buff my damage, that's something that you should know to decide whether you want to use it or not. That seems like an important decision. So any kind of important decision should be relayed in the game somewhere, either in some kind of help menu. You probably want to bury it as deep as people who care about it will go dig up and find it. People who don't care about it don't want it to be part of your UI and your screen when it's not going to be part of what they're considering as part of the active gameplay. So either have optionable turn on and off UI elements that display certain types of information, or embed information in a tutorial or help menu that can be as arbitrarily complicated as you need it to be. One and then two.
So this was kind of like me when I was playing like Final Fantasy 14.
Yep.
I started playing like summer of last year, and I hadn't played like a type of that type of game before since like when I was like 11 playing like Wizard 101 or Fire 101.
Yeah.
So like having like going in from like 2011 to like 2024, going to like a new new game. There was so much going on when I first joined it.
Yeah.
I still didn't know like half the things on it. All I know was like press 1 to hit, press 2 to like dodge or something. Like my friend had like sit me down and like told me like what each thing was, because I was so confused and overwhelmed.
Yeah. You see that a lot in massively multiplayer games.
Yeah.
There are a lot of systems that need to be in place by the end game. So the tutorial is really important, something that is easy to learn and increases the difficulty in terms of just the number of mechanics slowly over the course of the game is much better than just dumping something on you at the beginning of the game and saying, figure it out. That's frustrating.
Thanks, Dark.
Yeah, yeah. Any other points? Yeah,
In, it's in like most of the Ace Combat games. There's obviously like a bunch of different planes, and those planes all have various different stats. But only some of the games will actually give you numbers, others will only show you bars. And this works fine if you're just comparing like an aircraft with the one next to it. But if you actually have to scroll down the list to like look at a plane that's a lot farther down, it can be really hard to compare those stats. The number of times I've had to actually physically go up to my TV, put my finger at the right position on the bar, and then scroll down the control with my other hand is more than any game should make me do.
yeah, I agree, that the designer should be thinking about that. And that as an outcome of the game, and making some tool where you don't have to do that. All right, we are out of time already somehow, but we will come back.
What's going on?
Yeah, we'll come back tomorrow and start talking about combat. Combat design,
Turn-based.
yeah. I'll have a study guide to you by Friday as well for that last exam. I may perish between now and then, so no.
Find out.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, I love that too.
Beat that guy for secrecy.
Stop the lab.